And we are live. Great. So, good afternoon. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum. Peace to everyone joining us today for the launch of the fourth exhibition for Umi's Archive. Umi's Archive is a six-part online exhibition drawing on the life of my Umi, Amina Amatul Haqq, born Audrey Weeks, to create a space where we remember and dream. I begin today, as I begin everything, in the name of Allah, for the love of Muhammad, to honor the ancestors and the celebration of my people. I also begin an acknowledgement as a descendant of stolen people on stolen land, that the land upon which we gather is the unceded and ancestral territory of the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, also known as North America. I also begin an acknowledgement of the histories of imperialism, colonialism, and resistance that brought us here today, that every day is Ashura and every land is Karbala. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Jasmine Johnson. People I think by now know me. So I'm Abdul Khabeer, and I'm the curator of Umi's Archive. And my guest is Jasmine Johnson. I'm going to read her bio. Jasmine Elizabeth Johnson is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, a Ford Foundation Diversity Pre- and Postdoctoral Fellow. She earned her PhD in African Diaspora Studies at UC Berkeley. She has served as a scholar in residence at the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, a Ford Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Africana Studies at Barnard College, a Newhouse Center for the Humanities Fellow at Wellesley College, and a postdoctoral fellow in African American Studies at Northwestern University. In 2016, Jasmine was awarded the Michael L. Waltzler Award from Brandeis University for combining superlative scholarship with inspired teaching. Her work examines the politics of Black movement, including dance, diasporic travel, and gentrification. Interdisciplinary in nature, her scholarship and teaching are situated at the intersection of diaspora theory, dance, and performance studies, ethnography, and Black feminism. Her first manuscript, Rhythm Nation, West African Dance and the Politics of Diaspora, is under contract with Oxford, and her second book project is A Cultural History of Black American Dance. So thank you so much, Jasmine, for joining us today. It's really
Thank
great
you
to
for
have
having
you.
me. I'm so excited about the conversation.
Yes. So let me just give you guys a little background on the theme. So you might have seen a flyer and you were like, what does that say? Right? So it said, Weusi, Tutashinda, bila shaka, which is Swahili, which roughly translates into Black people we will conquer without doubt. And it's a terminology I got from a card we'll talk about today. It was a greeting card that my mother had signed but hadn't mailed to a friend in the early 70s. And it struck me, and we'll talk about the card itself, but it struck me in terms of the sentiment around Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism. That was a really big part of her life at that point in her life. It continued to be significant to her. Now, every exhibition in Umi's Archive every exhibition in Umi's Archive is tied to something important culturally, whether it's important to Muslims or important to Black folks culturally. And so when I thought about the themes of Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism in my mother's life, the first event that came to me that I wanted to connect it to was the African Street Festival, or the East, or the official name is the International African Festival of the Arts, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary last July 4th weekend. And for me, it was one of these spaces that really, kind of allow for all kinds of Black people. So you had your homeopathic elixirs and your cowrie shells and your West African dance. And you also had beef in a pocket and that lemonade that has way too much sugar in it, right? This is the kind of space it was. And so I wanted to connect those two. And so that's kind of the genesis, right, of this exhibition, Weusi. And another big part of it, so dance is really, so part of the reason why I invited Jasmine to join us is because dance was pretty central to my mother's embrace of Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism. And so we're going to start actually with a little bit of dance. So we're going to play a quick video to get into the conversation.
Dear Audrey, my girl, she is a stone black woman. She knows right from wrong. She has a mind like as big as the world. My sis can dance. Her dancing fills the world with exciting things. If you look at her while dancing, it makes you think. Think of the beautiful things in life. Her dancing is also a message to you. Alafia, my sister.
So it was really important to me because dance was so important to her, right? To kind of open in that way. And just as a little bit of background, the side, so this is, and actually this is the only video I have of my mother dancing, right? Even though we danced a lot, it's like the only one I have. And it was in 2014. And the person you hear squealing in the background is a cousin of mine, Majida, right? And she actually was living in the UAE, and there was this South African, they called it, restaurant. And so she invited the drummers to come over because we were there to celebrate my mother, right? And so we were there for that type of thing. And so that's the background of that video. And so then I wanted to figure out, so I wanted to kind of honor that. And the quote at the bottom that I'll read, let me read it. And then Jasmine, you can respond, right? So the quote actually is from, and you can show the photo too of the page from the yearbook. So my mother graduated in 1968 from Jamaica High School in Jamaica, New York. And then, 1968 is a year where a lot was going on, right, in the world. And so in her yearbook, there was an autograph note, and it said, "Dear Audrey, my girl, she's a stone black woman. She knows right from wrong. She has a mind like as big as the world. My sis can dance. Her dancing fills the world with exciting things. If you look at her while dancing, it makes you think. Think of the beautiful things in life. Her dancing is also a message to you. Alafia, my sis." And then it says love. I think it said Inyanyu, and then there was another name after that I couldn't interpret. And so that was where the that's the at the end of that dance. That's the voice you hear is reciting from that autograph note. So yeah, so I'll give you some space if you want to respond to that, Jasmine.
Oh, where to even enter? I feel so lit up. One, I love that video that you generously shared, and the way that you created a call and response that felt like it was very much in step with the spirit of that gathering, right? Like that you kind of continued that and brought. You didn't bring, but kind of remind us that the past is always present. And there's something really beautiful about that call and response that I love. And I was just like jotting all kinds of like the laughter and that space and like, the Black sociality that you can see happening in that space. And I think that it in some ways connects with what's written here, right? That like Black dance, Africanist dance, it doesn't simply represent, right? But it confers, right? Like it makes something new. It makes something possible in that moment. It's a kind of really bold instantiation of the now, right? For Black folks. And I think that is incredibly beautiful. I mean, the language in that note of like stone Black woman,
I know,
is just everything. And I think my favorite part though is the lines that her dance makes you think. Right, her dance makes you think. Like it's not about a kind of passive consumption. It's not about buying a ticket to the show to be anonymous. Right, it's a certain kind of like deep presence, and that when one is dancing and one is conjuring in the way that we know that Black folks do when they're in motion, it raises questions and it answers them as well. And I think that that's just really beautiful. That her dancing is a message to you, right? That it's a kind of beginning of a thinking rather than a kind of closure of representation.
Right. No, definitely. I like how you said that too, because I think often too, and also part of, for me, which has always been a kind of a message of sorts for Black dance, is the kind of ways in which Black people's physicality and movement dance is not intellectual, or it doesn't make you do those things. Like, it doesn't cause you to think about, it's just a feeling. And not because feelings aren't, but in that sense, like, in that kind of like Eurocentric dichotomy, right? Between kind of like feeling, and so the idea that he says that, right? Or he or they, I'm not sure who was the person says that, right? I think it's also pretty significant to me. And it also made me think because, and then, but also like this kind of, so one of the things that one of the kind of phrases I've been coining to talk about this exhibition is from Bobby Fox to Black Power, right? This is the kind of phrase I've been doing. And because when I was looking at, so I knew about dance from my mother. I knew West African dance was important for her. I knew it was important for her during her years in college. I knew that she was a student activist in college. She was the Pan-Africanist. I knew she was really involved in the movement. So I knew that, right? But then when I was going through the exhibition, I was also finding art and dance and music, but it was, sort of like Tchaikovsky or whatever, like piano, right? It's like ballerinas and tutus. Actually, can we show the picture of her in the tutu? Or some sort of tool that she has, right? It's some sort of recital she was a part of, right?
Yeah.
It should be the next slide. Can we go to the next slide? And we'll come to it. Anyway, so there's these, their art. So she's a Black person, right? She's a Black girl. She's a Black young woman, and she's doing this art. She's doing kind of dance. She's doing piano pretty seriously. But when I think of Black art, I think of, West African dance. I think of, kind of Black arts movement. So I thought to myself, I was like, so was she doing Black art before? Right? Or was, because on one hand, it's like, I was saying, like, from tutus to lapas, right? This kind of trajectory, right? But it's like, but then I'm like, but wait a minute, even like one of the other, what I want to say, one of the other documents in this exhibition is is like from a youth church service, right? Too, and they're singing this song. Here's the tutu. Here's the image of her in the tutu that I found. It's actually, when you go to the website, you'll see it's like 3 images, so it's almost in motion, right? They go in motion that kind of way. But there's one other one, is like this, it's called, so they were saying it's a hymn, and I'm not Christian, I wasn't raised Christian, so I looked it up. And it was like the whitest thing I've ever seen. I was like, I have never, it was so white, right? So again, so I'm thinking something, but it was a Black church she went to, it wasn't like, right? So anyway, so one of the things I was thinking, and so I'll open a space for you to enter into that conversation too, right? And then let's go to the next slide, because it also found this one image that I was really intrigued by, right? And maybe you can kind of speak to it, what you thought about it, because this is before college, right? So this is 65, so she's in high school, right? And she's performing African dance. But I'm like, where did this? I'm like, well, how did she know that? Where did that come from, right? And so anyway, so my questions, I guess, to you thinking about that is like, I guess how do you respond to those images?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, other than like complete adoration, it's interesting because now that I see them together, I don't think I saw them kind of like in this like diptych earlier. So it's interesting because it's actually pretty similar gestures that she's hitting in both of them, which is interesting, right? Like what makes a dance Black? I think to that earlier question, but I don't know. I think that there are, and this is not a certain kind of like insistence on like linearity or progress narratives, because we know that those often don't work for kind of thinking and theorizing Africanist art. But there does seem to me some relationship potentially between them, where we see this kind of dance is in some ways and we were kind of talking before we went live, thinking about class here, but dance, thinking about dance for a kind of particular class of Black folks as being a kind of marker of kind of like American assimilation in some ways, which is not synonymous with being anti-Black, but a certain kind of presentation of Blackness that was in some ways kind of in line with or in the spirit of kind of Eurocentric ideas of what bodily comportment look like and bodily control. And I think that often looked like, tap, jazz, ballet, right? That kind
Yeah.
of the recital trainings, right? Like
Yes.
these kinds of ways that in some ways like we're exercising a kind of respectability that might have happened on the dance floor, but I think was ultimately tied to broader ideas around kind of Black deservingness of full citizenship in some ways. And as folks become, I think, increasingly radicalized, that that shows up in dance forms as well. And I was saying that this move gives me Sosune a little bit, like
Right.
do right, like
right. Yeah.
The kind of things happening on the same side of the body, like that.
Right.
It seems like pretty in line with that choreography. And so for me, I think that there's a connection of kind of moving from bobby socks, as you write, or the tutu as a certain kind of physical choreographic training that is largely imposed by like some kind of like parents or kind of like supervisor figure in some ways,
right.
To transition toward a kind of movement practice that, whether real or imagined, don't matter, has some kind of connection to how folks are redefining Blackness in direct relationship to how I think that they're understanding and defining Africanness. Right. So that's some of the connections that I see between those two things. What do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I think so. So I was thinking about it, Sophie. At first, I'm like, okay, like I said, the white him, things like that. And I also think, my mother definitely grew up, from what I understand, she definitely grew up like as an upwardly mobile middle class, right? So she was born in Harlem. Her parents were born in Harlem. She was born in Harlem. But when she turned 3, they moved to Jamaica and Queens, which is Queens, but on some of the photos, it's like Jamaica, Long Island, because I think that's how they referred to it back then. And if you're from New York, the island is the suburbs, right? It's like, the island is Queens is the suburbs now, but it was then, right? So they move out from Harlem to Queens, right? They move into a house, right? It's my grandfather, my grandmother, my mother, and her little brother. He's just born, right? Everybody has their own room. You know what I mean? Like type of thing. So she definitely grew up, I think, middle class, and so you see that, I think, in the kinds of art, right, that she was engaged in the kinds of dance, that type of thing. And I think I agree. I do think this sense of, a kind of a middle classness, a respectability of sorts, right? It's still Black, but it is performing something different, which, I always say, like my mother, definitely, that generation committing class suicide, like that definitely was her reality, right? Like as she got older. So if we can go to like another slide, the next slide on this deck. So for example, there are also images from an African Liberation Day in 1973, right? It was like May 26, 1973 in Columbus, Ohio. So in 1968, my mother goes to Columbus, Ohio. And it's interesting too, because the story about her going to Columbus is that my grandmother was like, you can't go to the South because if you go to the South, you're too radical, you're going to get killed. Like, I don't want you going to the South. So you're not going to, she wouldn't go to HBCU. She waited so long to apply. Ohio State was kind of open, so she applied, right? But she ended up being very radical there. Like, it wasn't like this type of thing, right? And so, and part of her radicalism, part of her activism was through art. So she was there was a Black art society she was a part of, and there were these dance troupes she was a part of. And one of them was called the Uhuru Dancers. And so this picture, so this is the drummers, right? And the woman you see in the front is my mother. And if we go to the next slide, the next image, you see she's also the one with the shortest hair, I guess, in the front, right? And a friend of hers, Ben, they were friends from like junior high school. He went to Wilberforce. And he told me the story where one day he had there was a big rally and event in Columbus, and there was an activity on campus. He's like, your mother told me to come by. He's like, I come to the campus, and there are thousands of people here, and your mother's up front with the horror dancers getting it in, like this type of thing, right? And so, and another one of her friends from college, he says that she played he says, that she played a pretty significant role in bringing sort of West African dance to Columbus, because in an article from the Black student paper, it says that the Hurl Dancers was built by a group of 4 women, and they under the tutelage of this sort of, I don't know if it was an official professor, because they may not have had a professor at the time, but under professor, And she was one of those 4 women, right? And so this is very, and so for me it's interesting because so she's still dancing, right? She's still involved with arts and music, but it's very, very now very about connecting to the continent, connecting to that past, and really kind of removing ourselves from the kind of middle class respectability, right, of the past, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things inside of that. One, I was thinking a lot about that instructor who I think the write-up said was Ghanaian and also teaching in the PE program. So it's I'll just say kind of tangentially, it's interesting to actually think about the kind of institutionalization of dance studies in some kind of way. It's actually growing out of PE programs by and large, and the kind of role that African dance, African arts has kind of played in that, right? As kind of always already elective, right? Like it'll be ballet 1, 2, 3, modern 1, 2, 3, West African dance, all levels welcome, for example, right? Like it doesn't, like, you know, like it doesn't require scaffolding, right? And as if it doesn't require a real kind of holistic approach to, and I don't say that kind of romantically, that one can fully understand something as a whole, but at least in that image that you just showed, it looked to me like they were singing, like in the middle of song, actually, rather than being in the middle of choreography. So anyways, I that came to mind as you were speaking, and I do think that there's something so important about this moment and thinking about its relationship to the growth of the Black arts movement. And a certain kind of, impulse, whether it's institutionally through the founding of Black Studies departments and programs in this moment, and also thinking about the role that dance, West African dance, I think in particular, has played in that. Like when we look at these early departments or early programs, even if they were a cluster of classes, right, really being student led, and by and large, all of them had some kind of dance component in them, right? So it's to say that there's really no way one can have a certain kind of knowledge of or expertise in Black studies without having a certain kind of attention to the body, without having to try on rhythm in a particular kind of way, like that call and response, right? So there's something really beautiful about this, and that it's kind of connected to the institution, but they're performing for thousands of people. When I think about the evolution of the African Street Festival, how it's now very much tied to Dance Africa, that like there's really no way to understand, I think, Black radical politics without a certain kind of attention to the role that dance and drumming, since they're inextricable, are playing in this moment and beyond.
Yeah, and also in the exhibition, which people can check out on their own, in that Uhuru Dancers collection. So there's 2 items that I would point out for people to look at. So one is the program for, it was a play called, I think, A Forest of 1,000 Demons. And so this was, there was a West African, his first name was Olu. I can't remember his last name right now, but it's in the program, you can see it. So he writes this play, right, drawing on the kind of cosmological and spiritual traditions that he comes from, right? He writes a play and it gets performed on campus, but also off campus at a community center named Dunbar, right? And the Uhuru dancers play a part of that role too. And so there's also this image, and I thought about that because I have my own picture of being a little kid and being an West African dance class, West African dance class, right? And so there's a picture of these younger women, right? And they have little sort of like material tied around, and they're learning, right? And so there's also this kind of intergenerational sort of transmission, right, of sort of this knowledge and this dance form, but also this consciousness, right?
Yes.
Through, happening as well.
Yeah, I mean that it's. I think one of the reasons why it was so joyful to move through this series of archives, because one can really see the effort toward a kind of like, consciousness, sensibility that was not just Black, but really Black centered, right? Like really of and for people. And you get to see that, right? And I say that in part because I think sometimes Pan-Africanism, pro-Blackness, Black consciousness, Africanist consciousness sometimes gets described as like it's always already arrived in people without really understanding that kind of labor that it takes to get toward oneself, right?
Yeah.
And that, that happens through reading, that happens through a certain kind of self-regard, which I think we get through Umi's diaries. And I think that also happens through choreography, whether that happens, at a university or if that's happening on stage, that these are all folks actively moving toward a kind of individual and collective consciousness, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah. We're going to move to the diaries now, because I think the other thing that's interesting to me that people can also check out when they go through the exhibition, like I grew up in, uber pro-Black, kind of household, right? And, you grow up like that and the rest of the world's not like that. And sometimes you're just like, you need to relax, like take it down 1,000. It's not that deep, like, because, like that, I know I grew up sometimes being like, okay, it's like, Black people did everything, right? Like the first this, the first that, right? And you're kind of like, okay, great, thanks. but when I'm looking through Umi's archive and I'm looking at the different materials and I'm getting at also a glimpse in the world that she grew up in, right? And the ways in which, how important it was to arrive there and to make sure I also arrived there, right? Because of the world she grew up in. And not just in terms of, I mean, just the broader world, right? Wasn't one where that was, even thought of, right? Kind of thing. So in this exhibition, there's also a collection called Black Girlhood. And I want to shout out actually Professor Aria Holiday, who I knew when I was at Purdue, because I was like, I found this diary and I'm trying to look at this diary and I don't understand the diary. And I'm like, I know she works on this kind of stuff, right? And so I reached out to her just to be like, what do I do? And so she gave me some suggestions of things to read. And so I really appreciated her help. So just figuring it out. But I find this diary, and this is, I'm going to read what it says on this first page, right? So you can see. So it says, "Dear diary, you are my first personal response I can really put my thoughts into. Soon you will see a lot of me in this book. Sincerely, Audrey Weeks," right? Which is my mother's name. And this is in July 1962. And so in the diary, it has several entries, mostly from 1962 and 1963. So when she's 12 and when she's 13, right? In 1962 and 63, she's also entering junior high school, and she's integrating a junior high school, right? And this is the other thing that was so interesting to me, because I think of integration and you think of the South, right? But she's in New York City, right? But they were, her and her friends were the first Black class at this junior high school in Little Neck, which is a neighborhood in Queens. And so that's also the context. So, so she's in this junior high school. She's a Black student in this, part of a small group of Black students who are integrating this junior high school. So she's in the junior high school. She's a young Black girl. So this is one of the first pages that's there. If we go to the next one, and we can talk about that, because I know you had thoughts about it too. So I'm just going to read the January 28th. So January 28th, 1960. Yes, 2 or 3. I think it's 63. Okay. It says, "I've been having trouble with Dorothy, Stella, and Randy. It's not my day for social life. Michael, whom I like, is probably sick of me right after people said I liked him. I'm heavier and taller than him, which might cause some complications. He knows I like him. Oh, God, help me second and the others first. I know I'll hear a lot about me tomorrow." So I know you said that last line really struck out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the opening page that you read, that like, soon, my first personal response, soon you will see a lot of me, right? That like already it's beginning with like this real sense that like, I'm someone to learn, or someone to know, that I find to be incredibly moving, perhaps because Black girls, Black women are so often presumed to be intelligible, right? That, or like, people presume they might know, when, I mean, and Spillers always comes to mind, but like when really most people are trained with like the uses of Black women rather than Black womanhood itself, right?
Right.
And I think that that's something that makes these diary entries so powerful, to be able to hear from Black girls about themselves rather than kind of retroactive scholarship or, you know, that kind of cast light back. But here we have this gift of being able to understand her through her own words and her own experiences. And there's so much across all of the entries, but the kind of emotional range of, you know, how to navigate social groups. There's one where I think she describes herself, or she's like, I think I'm boy crazy.
Right.
Like,
Let's show that one, actually. Like, we can show that one.
These moments of self-discovery, like, oh, I think like here I am learning myself. Right. Like here I am learning myself. And it's just such I think a really generative place to be able to think about this kind of bundle of experiences that are on her mind, thinking about her own body, thinking about relationships and shame, thinking about like partnerships and what that looks like. And, you know, the anticipation that she's going to hear a lot about herself the next day. Like, there's just something really rich. And I think it largely has to do with the kind of beautiful insight into a Black girl's interiority and her own kind of self-making in relationship to these broader social groups that she's in, that I find to be really powerful, and immediately dispels the idea, right, that Black girls are anything but complicated.
Right. So let me read this entry that's on here, and I want to share something too. So this one says, so she says, "Dear Diary, today I just discovered how boy crazy I am. She says, look at this list. I promise you I'll wait my time. If the boy is in LP, which is her junior, LP is Lewis Pasteur, which is a junior high school. So she's listing them: Stuart Weiss, Michael Young, John Walker, new boy Mike, named Andy Topaz, Mr. Weckner, and Parnas. And then there's an arrow that goes down, and she names 3 more people: Gordon, Ronald, and Marty. But in spite, I still have a make-believe crush on a miraculous made-up Johnny, right? A good last name is Landers. So basically, she's telling people she has a boyfriend named Johnny Landers. There are people by that name. There are people by that name. And because of this lie, I spent $7.06 on a heart bracelet for a present faked from him. Some of my friends want to see him. I'm in double trouble. There might be a person like him, same name, in France, maybe, I hope." So it's great, right? Like, so I'm like, you know, so the 2 things I want to add. So the first entry, you know, when she talked about that, I read today, I'm heavier and taller than him, and that has complications. So I was like, I feel that, right? Because I grew up tall. I was a tall girl. People make fun of you, you know, and because of the gendered expectations in our society, right? That if you're a girl, you'll be with a boy, and the boy's going to be taller than you, and and there's this whole, and you're going to be small and petite and feminine, and all these kinds of things, right? And when you're a tall woman and a tall Black woman and a tall Black woman who's not skinny, like none of that is true, right? And there's a lot that can kind of, your sense of self, right, can really be impacted by that. So I really understood, and I felt that for her. And then in this part, you know, because I know I talked to her close friend Violet, because they went to junior high school together, and Violet she told me, she's like, your mother always was upset about the height because all the boys were short, and she always wanted to be shorter, right? Like, this is this kind of thing that happens, right? And so she makes up this boyfriend, which I think is hilarious, right? It's a hilarious thing that she does, right? To tell people she has that, and this imagination, right, that's going on here, right? To sort of do that. And so on one hand, so for me, it was bittersweet. So on one hand, it's like, it's this I'm heartbroken for like 12, 13-year-old Audrey, right? Because I'm like, she's beautiful, and you can see these photos of her on the website, and she's beautiful, and she's lively, and she's dancing, and she's piano, and all this kind of stuff is happening. But she has these insecurities, right? That are a product of the world that she's around. But what I appreciate what you're saying too, but she also does have a sense of self, right? And she does have an imagination, and she is like, deciding what she wants to do and how she wants to do it and this kind of thing. And there's another entry that we won't share today, but you can check it out, where it's like 3 years. So it's like, I don't know if I think it's maybe July. So like there's an entry from like July 62. And then she comes back and in July 67, and she writes a small note in response to that entry in July 62, which I thought was a really cool, just kind of meta text, I guess, type of thing to see as well. But also, I think her own growth, because my mother was not someone who was a wallflower. She wasn't like that. And so I think also it was really cool to kind of see, right? So like you said, this interiority, like what is she thinking? What are these young Black girls? What is she thinking as a young Black girl in the early 60s about herself and about boys and about family and about all that kind of stuff? Yeah. And how is that related to the woman she becomes, 5 years later, 10 years later, and so on.
Yeah. I wondered while I was reading the entries, do you have a sense of whether or not any of that friend group kind of like if she grew and matured alongside of them, or did she just kind of move out of that social group and into another?
So no, so from my understanding is that so it's interesting too, because some of the friends she mentions in the entries that are on there are like a cousin, like Rhonda or something, and people that my mother talked about even as an adult, like, oh, my friend Gail, like, this kind of thing. Like I said, her friend Violet, who she doesn't actually mention in these entries, but they integrated the school together. So Violet was telling me how, they would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and they would go to like New York Boulevard, which is now Girlhood Boulevard, and wait for this bus, right, to take them to Little Neck, right? And they were friends. I mean, they were friends till the day my mother passed away, right? And they also had something called, they had something which is really cool. They had something called the Pre-Boys Social Club. And so apparently I didn't know, apparently social clubs were a thing at the time, right? So this is about the time, they're probably like, this is probably like 1964 or so, maybe when the club opens, because there's a graduation card for her in 68 from the Pre-Boys. But the first event they apparently held today. So now picture this, because I'm talking to her. I'm like, how did this happen? Right? So she's like, yeah, we used to have events. We had an event at a place called the Dome in Manhattan. And she's like, we had an event. We charged people, made a little money. We made our own outfits. She's like, your mother was late. We got that kind of thing. But they had people performed at this thing. Willie Colon. She's like, yeah, we had Willie Colon. And I'm like, wait, what? Wait, come again? Wait, what? So she's like, yeah. She's like, yeah, he played at the event we had. And it's interesting because, well, one, and so I'm like, how is this possible? I'm looking at it, and he's their age. So this is right before he becomes kind of famous, the famous kind of settle that he is now. So he plays this thing, but also it's interesting for dance because salsa and like kind of dance, cumbia, all these different dances from kind of Spanish-speaking Caribbean are also a big part of my mother's life. Like she took Spanish in high school, in junior high school, and in college. She wanted to be an interpreter in junior high school. But her friend Benny was telling me he still has a record he has from her. Right? It was I forget, the song is Asuka Pati. I forget who is the artist, right? But he was like, that was Latin dance, which is what they called it back then. Like that was also a big part of their world. So yeah, so they definitely like were together. And even in the next exhibition that's coming in August, there's this letter that she wrote to Violet. And in the first exhibition, there was a letter from Violet in 71. And in 71, my mother's like, she's a total radical, right? So she's like, this and that and that. And so she's writing to Violet, telling her about, what's going on in the world. And like, you should raise your daughter as a revolutionary. And our people need this. And, this and that, whatever, right? So they definitely stayed together, as a group, at least the ones that I know of who were there back that time too. Yeah. Yeah. But that Willie Colon story, I was like, wait, I was like, the Willie Colon, like for real? And she's like, yeah, and I'm like, she's like, we weren't just in high, they're 14 years old, throwing a party they live in Queens, they're throwing a party in Manhattan, and they got people, and they make a little money. And Ben, he was like, how he had just got this brand new cashmere coat. He was like, that was a big deal. You know? And he said someone stole it from Coat Check and they took his coat and left him with their old coat. Yes, I know. but it's cool. But one of the things I love about in this exhibition too is just like, you know, the kind of lives, right? The kind of growth, kind of things that are happening with this young Black folks, right? Her friends, their friends, what they're doing, what's going on with them, I think is really fun. So there's a lot of, so there's like deep stuff, and there's also just really fun and hilarious and things that you can also relate to too, right? So I want to move to the next thing we wanted to talk about, thinking about Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism, you know, and the kind of plurality of Blackness and why that becomes important. And so there's a collection that I'm just calling Afrocentricity in this exhibition. And if we can go to that slide with the Kiswahili. And, you know, I feel like, you know, I was thinking, it's interesting because I was thinking about even using the term Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism, like I was like, you know, people are going to think certain things, you know, about what this is. And, you know, like
I know.
Right. Yeah. But at the same time, I felt like it was really important to do justice to what that meant for her, right? And what it might still mean. And so this was one thing, this is one that was it. So she took Swahili when she was in college at Ohio State. She took beginner and intermediate Swahili. And so this was one of the textbooks that she used. And also in the exhibition is her, syllabus, right, from that class. And then the next image, can we go to the next image? This is a book that I found in the archive, The Name Negro, Its Origin and Evil Use. And it fit here specifically also because inside the book, and you can see this on the exhibition. So basically the story, real quick, the story of the book. So Richard B. Moore, who I, to be honest, did not know who he was. So I was like, who's Richard B. Moore? So he turns out to be born in Barbados, but basically becomes a New Yorker like in the early part of the 20th century. And he's a communist, he's an organizer, he's an author, right? He's giving lectures, and someone's like, we want you to do a lecture on this thing about the name Negro. So a committee is formed, like they form a committee to do this lecture, and John Henrik Clarke is on this committee, right? And so his picture is in the book, right? So I thought that was also really powerful and to see, and also the Barbados part, because my mother's maternal grandparents are of Robert B. Moore's generation, coming from Barbados as well. So like her maternal grandmother came to New York in like 1914, something like that. So that was also part of, I was like, you know, I wanted to include that because I think part of, for me, part of why Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism become important, right, is because, and I think you use this in your notes, and I'll open it up so you can respond well, because of the ways, right, politically, socially, culturally, like the US, like how, you know, the state has failed, you know, Black people, right? You know, and so, you know, this is not working, you know, and we need something else, you know, in a way. That's one way to thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. I think we share being raised in very pro-Black, very Pan-Africanist homes. Like, it, no joke, maybe I couldn't wear watches until like 9 years old, because I was like, they just remind me of shackles. Like, it was just like so much. It was just so like to the point where my mom was like, I think you're okay with you'll be okay. But I hear you honoring your people, right? But like that was just the norm. That was just the norm. And it really wasn't until or through educational contexts, actually, that I began to calibrate and learn that wasn't everyone's normal. Anyways, I say that because you know, I can really deeply remember the kind of ways that it became immediately apparent to me why that training was so important. And I understood the historical context, but it really wasn't until I kind of was thrown or catapulted into contexts where Blackness wasn't centered, or, you know, where Black lives really were kind of inconsequential, to be honest. That I understood the kind of efficacy of that human training, right? Of how to actually be in ethical relationship to others. So, you know, there's something that feels really important about understanding Pan-Africanism, Afrocentricity as strategies, right? As strategies to say, you know, this is how we can be in relationship to ourselves and to each other. And this is also a certain kind of relationship and confrontation with kind of sober history, right? I think is huge and efficacious in that moment, right? That, like, I understand the kind of move from Pan-Africanism to diaspora to be about a different kind of emphasis, but at the bottom, right, it is a certain kind of awareness that there are many ways to think about Black liberation. That project has to be a global one in many ways, that we have to tie racial apartheid to colonialism. And then there's this sense that also happens at the level of culture, that happens at the language that happens at the level of language, and that also happens at the level of dance and music. So I think that's, you know, it has all of my respect, right? Because it's a moment where folks are being like, well, actually, we're in the aftermath of this giant civil rights technical win, right? With the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then we see immediately the kind of ways that those kind of technical wins don't necessarily manifest in real transformation of the kind of quality and conditions of Black people and Black living. Right. So folks are like, well, that's great, but so now we need a different kind of strategy. And part of what needs to be central to that strategy is us organizing for us, rather than going around and asking for someone else, rather than trying to convince somebody else that we're worthy. Let's just decide that we are, and move from there.
Exactly. Yeah. This image that's on the screen now is a greeting card. So there's a collection of greeting cards in this exhibition, and this is one of them. It wasn't sent. And you can look at it on the website, and there's like a transcript for it. But basically, actually you kind of read it, but she's, you know, she says, I send this card with earnest hopes that the new year will be a prosperous one for all our people. And our is underlined, right? Right. And this is the card where I got, because you see at the top it says Hujambo and Ndugu Weusi, right? So that's where Weusi came from. And then it says in quotation marks, she has Tutashinda, bila, shaka, we will conquer without a doubt. And, you know, I thought to myself, you know, I was actually just listening to this lecture on Black Studies. I think it was like a lecture series on Black Studies called The Crisis in Black Studies. And the scholar Ronaldo Walcott gave a talk, and he made this point that I thought was really interesting. He made this point because, you know, like, at least on social media, people talk about the diaspora wars, right? This is this phrase that comes up, right? And so he was talking about that. And for people who don't know, right? Diaspora wars on the playful side, it's like who makes the best jollof, right? Type of thing, right? Or whatever, right? But on the less playful side, it's kind of about tensions, right? This idea that different kinds of Black people do not actually really have the same alignments, and there's actually, you might be in competition with each other and this kind of thing, hence a war, right? Or competition for dominance, or who can speak. So, but he was making this point about it, and he's talking about in relationship to reparations, actually, and the current reparations conversation that we see in the United States. And he was saying that, you know, these diasporas reify the nation state. And the quote I really liked, he said, because diaspora wars are about national claims of difference and not about diaspora at all. And I thought that was really interesting because, you know, for me, coming from a kind of Afrocentric Pan-Africanist background, when I entered the academy and I entered the Black Studies as a, you know, as a student, right, in a graduate program, you know, the goal there is to break all that down, right? It's to sort of, at least my experience, right? It's like, you know, well, this was kind of, you know, Africa is static, you know, it doesn't move, you know, like these, which are important critiques, like they're not unimportant critiques.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I felt like, but so the critiques are important about the ways in which these kinds of sort of practices, theories, and philosophies can, erase difference among people of African descent that is significant and important that we should hold on to, right? Yeah. But at the same time, I feel like there's also a need because these things are connected, right? Because what's happening right now in Haiti, right, is connected to us. Like it's not, this is not something that is completely distant and we have no relationship to. And so it's kind of like, holding both of those things at the same time. And for me, what's interesting, I thought about it, I was like, while in the intellectual discourse, and even some of this discourse around reparations, the specificity becomes important in the art and the music and the food and the language, like the kind of the interconnectedness is always there, right? It's like, I feel like it never, you never see someone, I feel like I've never heard, like I've seen a piece of art or a dance or something. It's like, well, you can't be like, oh, but they do that over there too. And we do it like that too. You know what I mean? Like you can't, like, it's like impossible in a way, right? To kind of do that. And so, that also sort of kind of struck me, thinking about just that conversation and what Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism meant to her, but what it might also mean to me, what it might also mean today, as we still continue, right, to struggle for liberation, So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And the ways that we can, I think we can learn from these trainings, I think in some ways of how to be human and Black and human and kind of understand the urgency and necessity of coalition without sameness being a prerequisite for entry. Right. That the truth is that there are retentions and that there are transformations and innovations. The truth is that, there are some common denominators across Africanist dance here and there, and also a lot of heterogeneity. The truth is that we have linked fate, and also the nation state does impact us differently. The truth is that, like, the condition of the institution of slavery in some ways inspired this kind of call to imagine a kind of definition of Blackness that did not begin with enslavement, right? And that sometimes that included a kind of imagined past in some ways.
Right.
The truth is that, like, lots of folks spend time on the continent and, have a certain kind of rigor and expertise. And I think all of this is true, right? All of this is true. And I think that is something that is helpfully messy, right? Because, by mess, I don't mean I don't actually mean it with a negative connotation. I mean something that is like, so wonderfully complicated. And when you look at a movement, you look at a dance, maybe you're looking at Fela on Broadway.
Right.
What makes it diasporic is in part the fact that it's in some ways impossible to parse out, right, the different kind of origins or notions of authenticity. That, like, what makes it diasporic is the impossibility of finding out what's at the bottom. And I think that's a real gift. So inside of this archive, I mean, I learned a lot and have been really beautifully reminded of the necessity of Pan-Africanism to get us toward a different kind of horizon, right? To not mistake how far we've come for the horizon itself, but to, be in relationship with Black folk here and there, to be able to think about the potential and I think the complications of diasporic collaboration.
Yeah. I think it's also, and you were saying it's messy and complicated, and it's messy and complicated and human, right? Which is also why we think about Black folks and Black studies as how we understand the human condition, right? Like this is an entryway to that, right? Because all of those things that are there. So thank you. I did. Running out of time. We didn't talk about your grandparents' bookstore. I wanted to mention that before we ran out of time because I thought it was so cool. But maybe you could just quickly just mention it because I think that's just dope. So
I'll just say very quickly, yes, my grandparents opened a bookstore in the Bay Area. It's called Marcus Books. It's the oldest Black-owned bookstore in the country and is still going strong in Oakland and has lots of connections to many of the things that we've been talking about today, but is in part the kind of my anchor of maybe like when and where I enter.
Yeah, no, so thank you for that. And as a side note, I'll tell you about my Oakland connections later, but it's great. But I thought that was cool because there's because this came up actually when Jasmine and I were talking before the conversation today. We were talking about the greeting card exhibition collection, and she was saying, "Oh yeah, my grandparents own this bookstore. You had plenty of greeting cards," and I love the greeting card collection in particular just because. They're all Black, but in different kinds of ways, and so I really liked how it presents itself, right? So we think about being pro-Black, it's like dashikis and or something, right? But there's some other ways that these cards happen too. So anyway, so people should check that out. But before we go, I want to thank you, Jasmine, for participating and sharing so generously and being a part of this conversation with me. I want to tell people that I want to just give you an announcement. So 2 things. One, you guys can go to umisarchive.com right now, and you can do a deep dive right into Weusi, Tutashinda, bila, shaka, this move from Black bobby socks to Black power. And these shifts, right, in Black identity from the 50s to the 70s through my mother's life. And then prepare yourselves for the next exhibition, Black Power and Its Legacies, that opens on August 7th. For that exhibition, I'll be in conversation with Brother Jihad Abdul Mumit. He's the chairman of Jericho Movement. He's a former political prisoner. He's a playwright. He does all these really great things. And we're going to be talking really about that. We're talking about political education, political organizing, and the prison industrial complex. And those things come from my mother's life. And so I'll be in conversation with him on that on August 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Same link, bit.ly/umisarchive, where you can get that. And so that'll be really exciting. If you are like, how do I learn more? How do I stay in tune? Well, if you go to umisarchive.com, at the bottom of the page, there's a link that says stay in tune. And if you do that, you can sign up and you can get the emails, right? So you can know what's happening, because this is our 4th exhibition and we have 2 more left. So Black Power and Its Legacy in August. And let me announce this. So remember I said at the beginning, each exhibition is tied to a cultural moment or event. So the August 7th exhibition is tied to Black August, right? Black August is a commemoration of Black resistance. It starts in the early 1970s from Black people who were imprisoned in California. And there's a long history to that, which we'll talk about in August, right? But that was kind of the theme, right? And the motivation for doing that topic in August. And then the final exhibition is called Distant Relatives on Diaspora, Black Ethnicity and Black Freedom. And we'll be talking about some of the stuff we kind of ended on today, but going a little bit deeper through Umi's archive. So that is what we have for you guys today. Again, thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Global Deaf Muslims, for the interpretation, the ASL interpretation. Thank you for everyone, the whole team for Umi's archive, everyone who's participated to help me make this possible. And with that, I will say assalamu alaikum. Peace out. Have a good afternoon.